Zdravstvuyte, and welcome to my second Soviet Union vlog. In this episode, we're going to consider Lenin's initial steps to create a communist government in the Soviet Union. This is part of theme one, which is all about that. And the big questions here would be, why did Lenin establish a one-party state? Although bear in mind that the essay questions in part A, where the political and economic questions are more frequently situated, can only be a minimum of 10 years long. So they could get around that by asking a question from 1917 to 28, of course. But you're more likely to get a second type of questions, perhaps, which would be, how is Lenin's communist one-party state different or similar to later versions under Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev? And indeed, the exam board have deliberately flagged up the idea that students will need to understand changes in leaders' control of the state across the years 1917 to 85. They've explicitly said that in their outline of what you need to learn. So just pause and consider the situation of Lenin in October 1917. He's just seized power. This is his lifelong ambition. He's very excited. But as he looks at the situation, of course, he's in a very tricky position. The Soviet Union, as they're going to be called, are stuck in the First World War, and it's going very badly for them. And not only that, but the First World War itself is draining the economy of any life that it had in it, and that was limited to start with. There's very poor amounts of industry and a growing agricultural crisis, partly due to the state of the economy, and partly due to a lot of the troops and animals and livestock being taken away from the farms and used in the military. Added to that, the Bolshevik party that Lenin headed up was a small party of professional revolutionaries, and they'd been very effective at seizing power, but they had limited support, even amongst the other socialist groups, and considerable opposition. And that opposition grew as time went on. So they're in a very, very tricky position. And in that position, it's not surprising, perhaps, that Lenin chose to implement a one-party state. However, at the beginning, it's not necessarily what he was looking to do. So if we wind back slightly and think about the actual government political situation at the time of the revolution, local Soviets had been established across Russia, certainly across Western Russia, which were local councils of soldiers or workers or perhaps even peasants who had gathered together to take control of their patch of land, their factory, their town, and to make democratic decisions. Effectively, these are democratic organizations springing up from the ground. And they sent representatives from across Russia, Soviet Union, as we tend to call it in this course, to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. So from June 1917, they arrive in Petrograd, in St. Petersburg, and they discuss Russia's future there. It's there that Lenin says, and the Bolsheviks, that it's this All-Russian Congress of Soviets that should form the basis of future government. But of course, that Congress is not just a Bolshevik Congress. It has Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries in it, and people from other parties too. And so there are a number of people, including some Bolsheviks like Kamenev and Zinoviev, who believe that a broad coalition of parties will form after the revolution, and that there'll be collaboration and cooperation in the running of Russia. And in fact, there are a bunch of left SRs that join the initial government in a coalition with the Bolsheviks, and even hold some junior ministerial roles. But, of course, this All-Russian Congress is too big to meet regularly. It's very unwieldy. And so out of that are elected a council to take day-to-day control. And this is standard practice, really, in most governments and democracies around the world. This body in Russia was called the Sovnarkom, Sovnarkom. And this Sovnarkom was made up of 13 what were called People's Commissars, quite grandly. Lenin was the chair. Trotsky was head of foreign affairs. Stalin was in the initial Sovnarkom as head of the People's Commissariat of Nationality Affairs, basically in charge of ensuring that other nationalities within Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, were content and happy and go along with things. All of these commissars were revolutionaries that had backed Lenin since 1903, and many of them had worked with him in exile. And of course, there's a majority Bolshevik, in fact, probably all Bolsheviks there. So immediately, the Bolsheviks are taking power for themselves, even though there's this sense of wider representation in the body beneath them and in some collaboration with them through the left SRs. Two things happen to really, or three things happen really to put a big dent in that idea of this broad coalition. The first one is that it had already been arranged that in January 1918, a constituent assembly would be elected. This constituent assembly was kind of like a parliament, and its job was going to be to meet and to create a new constitution for Russia. Remember, the old Tsar's gone and a provisional government's been put in place, but there's not a permanent government, and that's what this constituent assembly is elected to achieve, a new constitution, and this is how we're going to work from now on. Those elections are allowed to take place, which in itself suggests that maybe Lenin hadn't decided he was going to have a one-party state dictatorship. Maybe. But those elections don't go so well for the Bolsheviks. They do win 175 seats. They do get 9 million votes, which sounds quite impressive. But the Socialist Revolutionaries gather 410 seats and 21 million votes. Now, clearly, this is not a ringing endorsement of Lenin, although they're a small party, so it's kind of expected, I guess. What happens is the Constituent Assembly meets, but only for one day, and Trotsky and some Red Guards turn up and shut it down forcefully and say that actually all power must reside in the hands of the Soviets. The Constituent Assembly is consigned to the dustbin of history, says Trotsky. So this is the first step towards a centralised one-party state by effectively ignoring these elections and cancelling the Constituent Assembly. The second step occurs with one of Lenin's key policies. Lenin is very clear right from the start that the First World War has to finish, that Russia has to get out of it, and that they will have to surrender to Germany and sue for peace. Now, they do that straight away, but of course, leaving the war in that sort of circumstance leaves them at the mercy of Germany, and Germany are all too happy to take advantage of this. This leads in March 1918 to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia really had no ability to fight back, but this is a very, very, very harsh treaty, and you probably have some awareness of the Treaty of Versailles. This is very similar in its pitch and in its tone. So Russia was going to be made to pay, for instance, 3,000 million rubles in damages. And it was going to lose the Ukraine, Finland, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and parts of Poland were lost as well. There are huge tracts of land, huge tracts of really good land as well, land that was agricultural. A lot of their industry was in this land, in the western part of Russia. So this was a humiliating and very punitive treaty, but they're in no position to fight against this. Literally in no position to fight against it. They don't have an army, and things are melting down at home. So Lenin says that we must sign this. There is notably, there's a lot of debate in the party about it, a lot of disagreement in the party about it, and that's a sign that Lenin, as a dictator, is a dictator, perhaps, who will listen and argue and will reach a collaborative agreement. But in the end, he says, look, if you won't sign it, if you won't endorse the signing of it, I'm off, and has to threaten to resign to get it through. He does get it through, and people back it and sign it. But the left SRs don't. And this is the case, the point at which they leave the coalition. And from here on, from March 1918 on, there are no other party representatives other than the Bolsheviks in their government. So now we've achieved a one-party government. And in the following months, things progress even further. That in April and May, there are elections to the Soviet. And again, the Communist Party do all right, but not that well. Lenin claims that these elections are unfair, and he doesn't recognise the results. Future elections are postponed, and the whole thing is kind of closed down. In fact, interestingly, this also triggers some purging of the parties. First of all, in May 1918, of the Communist Party itself, half of their members are kicked out of the party. They're not executed, but they're kicked out of the party. This is the first Chistka, or purge. And then, following an assassination attempt on Lenin himself in August 1918, a lot of SRs are arrested. By 1921, further arrests of SRs and Mensheviks have mean that they're completely debilitated. And by 1922, there are no other political parties. Now, next time we'll talk about perhaps censorship and the impact of the Civil War. But this is the sort of gradual process by which Lenin established a one-party state. It's important to remember that whilst he may have intended it, and ideologically the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat is a Marxist policy statement, and it makes sense looking back that they would end up being in a one-party state. That said, there is a sort of a reactive element to the policies that Lenin had, and they emerge over time and in particular situations. And so I think if you could characterize this as a gradual development of a one party state, where elections are held, and then afterwards, because the results didn't go well, parties are removed and banned, and people are arrested. And that over time, and in the context of the Civil War, there is a growing centralization, but that it's slightly erratic and chaotic development of that process. We'll pick up on this next time when we'll look a little bit more at the other things that are going on in these initial years. But I hope that's helpful in terms of the structure of the government, and I will see you next time.